So, in my forthcoming book, The Indian Revolution Movement in Europe 1905 to 1918, which is out with Liverpool University Press in August, I explore a broader landscape beyond the English-speaking imperial sphere. And instead of focusing solely on the transnational ties between Britain and South Asia, I view the entire topography of Europe as a vibrant venue for Indian anticolonialism, including in Paris, actually. The sort of central argument of my book is that rather than understanding the Indian revolution movement, freedom struggle only within the borders of territorial nationalism, we must explore both the exilic lives, constant movement across borders, and activities within Europe's major cities. And rather than viewing these movements simply through the lens of transnationalism, I lean more toward a trans-regional perspective. And the book examines how Indian revolutionaries traveled across Europe, connecting metropolitan spaces and organizing within Europe's borders. And this approach opens new ways of understanding continuities and disruptions across time and space. It I think, expands the transnational perspective to embrace the specificities of Europe, and it breaks with binary understandings of metropole and colony to go beyond British imperialism and territorial anticolonialism. And by paying attention to the particularities of the European intellectual, social, and political environment, I argue that while these metropolitan centers were defined by the narrative of colonialism, they were simultaneously sites of anticolonialism. This also means that the spirit of anticolonialism guided the self-identification of these Indian revolutionaries in exile, as well as their social and political interactions. They actually refer to themselves as revolutionaries and thus inserting themselves into a powerful and broad tradition. In these sort of villages abroad, as Tim Harper calls many of these centers in Europe, Indian revolutionaries engaged in radical discourses that were less available to them within India during a time of great global technological and communicative change. They had conversations with other revolutionaries from Egypt, Ireland, and Persia, as well as Russia, Poland, Finland, and even China and Japan. And as they took part in these conversations abroad, their struggle evolved from nationalist to internationalist, while also challenging traditional European notions of internationalism. In this sense, their presence, their activities, and resistance subverted the imperial project from within, changing the nature of European imperialism and shifting it towards decolonization and formal independence many years later. Equally important, I also propose that exiled struggles challenge nationalist visions of history, specifically the notion that Indian anticolonialists were consumed entirely by territorial nationalism. Instead, in my book, I emphasize the plurality of solidarities, collaborations, and networks to reveal new paradigms of anticolonialism's many incarnations. Through this understanding, I am mindful that while the Indian revolutionary struggle was not a uniform experience, fighting for independence from Britain bound these figures together in a new form of internationalism. And while the differences that emerged between, for instance, Hindus and Muslims within the exiled movement, or the debates over the resort to terrorism, these debates really remain highly relevant today. So, in other words, my book is also an attempt to account for the inclusivity and diversity of the freedom struggle, to acknowledge different strategies, to contest selective historical accounts, and to challenge contemporary Hindutva nationalist narratives in India, for instance. Looking more closely, the scholarship on the Indian revolutionary movement in exile still relies predominantly on a nationalist framework. So while there's a substantial body of work on Indians in Britain, it often overlooks cross-border movements. The scholarship on Indians in France is remarkably scant. The work on Switzerland and Sweden is even more limited. And while there's a larger body of work on the so-called Indian-German conspiracy during the First World War, these national histories often seem incredibly disconnected. We still have a limited sense of how these histories were actually connected, how revolutionaries moved across Europe, how they articulated new forms of anti-colonial thought and praxis. This also means, I think, that we have to use different sets of archives. And in my book, I draw on intelligence reports, newspapers, memoirs, primary sources such as periodicals, pamphlets, and manifestos in different languages from archives across Europe and India. And this challenges the sort of predominant Anglophone approach to histories of the Indian freedom struggle in exile, and we can talk more about this later. But I think one of the sort of the impetus for my book was when I worked on an AHRC-funded project called Making Britain, that was about the history of South Asians in Britain from 1870 to 1950. And what I discovered was that many of the history stopped there, within Britain. And that didn't really account for all these revolutionaries who then moved to France, to Switzerland, to Germany, to Sweden, with incursions into Italy and Denmark and the Netherlands and whatnot. So those histories were really incredibly disconnected. And at the same time, when I started looking into then the Indian revolutionaries in Paris, I think that aside from one article from the 80s, I think there's one other article in English. The same in Switzerland, there was like one book chapter that was published in 2020 or something. In Sweden, one book chapter, and all of these histories seemed incredibly disconnected. So what I've tried to do in my book is to connect all those stories, but following the people that moved across the European landscape. So what do I mean by all of this? Let me start with a story from the book that starts about 30 minutes walk from here, or one boulevard to Montparnasse. I'm pointing in, I don't know which direction. I can't remember it now. Let me start with one of the stories that starts over there. So in late 1908, the Indian revolutionary Lala Hardayal arrived in Paris from London. When Sadasin Rana, an Indian pearl merchant and financier of revolutionary activities, met him at Gare du Nord, the illness-ridden Hardayal was, quote, carrying a whiskey bottle and a chicken, Rana recalled later. After seeing a doctor and recovering at Rana's place at 44 Rue Blanche, which is up in the 9th, just kind of south of Moulin Rouge, Hardayal moved on to rooms at Madame Cadieu's boarding house over at 144 Boulevard de Montparnasse. It was the same boarding house that had previously hosted Bikaji Rustam Karma, who was known as Madame Karma, really a central figure amongst the Indians in Paris at the time, as well as Perin Naroji, who was the granddaughter of the so-called Grand Old Man of India, Dadabhai Naroji, and who was now studying at the Sorbonne, and who was in the care of Madame Karma at Dadabhai Naroji's request. As a side note, during her time here, Naroji was romantically involved with two Polish exiles. One of them was Witold Broniewski. Apologies for butchering any of the Polish names or French names, sorry. Broniewski was a radical nationalist and also studying here at the Sorbonne. She was also involved with Boleslav Biegas, an artist and sculptor. And both of these figures lived within a few minutes away from the boarding house. And in fact, the area was also known, I think, for the many Polish and Russian revolutionaries in exile. I think some of the Russians, like Lenin was a little bit further to the south, Trotsky as well. Vladimir Burtsev, who was a sort of a socialist revolutionary, was on Rue de Guerre and sort of close by. Which means obviously that these connections were also a matter of geography. You could easily walk 5 minutes and meet other revolutionaries, Polish, Russians, whatever. And Hadayal lived there briefly as well. In mid-August 1909, Hadayal and his friends Kashi Prasad Jayaswal and Chandulal traveled from Paris to Geneva in Switzerland to attend a Congress of Young Egyptians held from the 13th to the 15th of September. The Congress heard speeches by the Egyptian nationalist Mohammed Fahmy, Mansour Rifat, and Mohammed Lutfi Guma, as well as Thomas M. Kettle of the Irish Parliamentary Party, and Keir Hardie, the veteran Scottish socialist and anti-imperialist of the Independent Labour Party. I'm not an expert on Egyptian revolutionaries in exile, but the photo here, so I don't recognize the people in the photo, except here at the center I see Keir Hardie sitting. So Hadayal and his friends went to this Congress in Geneva in September 1909. In August they left and attended this in September 1909. Hadayal was not satisfied with the activities and agitation of the Egyptians, as they did not seek the radical promise of freedom from British rule. He said, and I quote here, "The Egyptian Congress, which was held at Geneva on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of September, was distinctly a success as far as it went, but it did not go far enough." In fact, Hadayal went on, and I quote here again, "The program was not a sufficiently practical one. There was too much talk of international action and too little thought of national self-help." Hadayal criticized both Guma's advocacy for peaceful agitation, as well as Keir Hardie's call for constitutional methods, and also Hardie's call to avoid secret societies. But he also noted that the young Egyptians who were in Geneva did not agree with Hardie's call, suggested methods. Calls for internationalism and anti-colonial alliances, Hadayal argued, should be redirected towards active rebellion. I quote here again, "We have no sympathy with the cant of constitutionalism," Hadayal said and concluded, and I quote here again, "We're ready to cooperate with our Egyptian comrades if they are sensible and begin to prepare for rebellion against English rule. We warn them against the wiles of self-styled Friends of Egypt in England. We advise them to distrust all cowardly and stupid Egyptian leaders who decry the policy of active resistance. We too join the chorus of long live Egypt." Hadayal's account of the Egyptian Congress in Geneva is indicative of the militancy of Indians in Europe at the time, compared to the more constitutional forms of anti-colonial agitation by the Egyptians. The British were trying to keep track of the Indians in Europe, but they had little, they were clueless as to what had happened at the Congress. They reported that some Germans who Hadayal met there, and I quote, had promised many things and sympathized with the views of the Indian nationalists. Perhaps the British were concerned with the prospect of an Indian-German alliance. I'll come back to this later. While he was in Geneva, Hadayal arranged for the printing of Madame Karma's new journal, Bande Mataram, which was an homage to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's 1882 nationalist poem, Bande Mataram. And it was a sort of a direct European continuation of the Calcutta-based weekly Bande Mataram, which had recently been banned by the British government of India in the crackdown against Indian newspapers in India. Despite being left alone by the French authorities here in Paris, at the suggestion of some of the Russian revolutionaries in Paris, perhaps Ilya Rubanovich, who was a Russian socialist revolutionary, and he was the editor of the Tribune Russe, which was also printed in Geneva but published out of Paris. Karma suggested that their new publication should be printed in Switzerland, essentially to avoid potential imprisonment for printers, as had happened with the Indian Sociologist, another radical Indian periodical edited by the wealthy Shyamji Krishnavarma, who lived out in Passy, in the suburbs. Again, I'm pointing in that direction, I'm not sure. But, so the Bande Mataram was financed by Karma. She was incredibly wealthy, but it was edited by Lord Hadayal, and from October 1909, with the help of MPT Acharya, who had recently arrived from London, Morocco, Lisbon, and then in Paris. And the first issue appeared in September 1909. The shipment of the first issues went to Hadayal over at Madame Cadier's boarding house at Boulevard de Montparnasse when he returned home. Taking advantage of the paradox between sort of British colonial rule and repression both in India and gradually also in Britain, as well as the sort of freedom of French liberalism as they saw it, Madame Karma and Hadayal boldly stated in the first issue that, and I quote here, "From our retreat in a free and civilized country, we shall speak out our mind without fear or anxiety. Exile has its privileges. It is the price paid for the right of preaching the truth as it appears to us." In other words, exile offered the Indians a different venue for publishing propaganda. They could publish propaganda here in France, in Britain, in Switzerland, but not in India. A few months later, Hadayal assessed the status of the Indian revolutionary movement in exile, and he remarked again in Bande Mataram, I quote, "The center of gravity of political work has shifted from Calcutta, Pune, and Lahore to Paris, Geneva, Berlin, London, and New York." Hadayal's statement reflects the importance of the exile movement, of new centers from which inter-revolutionary networks have emanated, and hence also, I think, at a slight rejection of parochial Indian nationalism. So, what does this story tell us about the Indian revolution movement in Europe? Let me start with Hadayal. He was arguably one of the most prominent Indian revolutionaries and intellectuals of the period. This is both how his contemporaries referred to him, but even in the last 5-10 years, there's a sort of a growing scholarly interest in his intellectual output, which ranged from anti-colonial publications, such as the Bande Mataram, but also a publication called The Liberator, which was edited by a Paris-based American Republican called Edward Holton James, who was the nephew of Henry James, the famous author. So he published this periodical, The Liberator, here in Paris. There was also Het Tijdschrift, which was a Dutch-Indonesian anti-colonialist periodical edited by Ernest Doris Dekker. Hadayal published in anarchist publications, such as the Scottish publication called Spur. There was an anarchist publication called Y out of Tacoma in Washington State in the US. There was a Mexican publication called Regeneración. So this kind of reflects a little bit his sort of political movements and intellectual sort of, ideology. And I think it reflects his political trajectory and global itinerary as well. So let me just briefly recap that, actually. He had arrived in Britain to study at the University of Oxford in 1905, but left the university in 1907 and joined the revolution movement in London. He moved from London to Paris in 1908. He was constantly on the move and proceeding to North Africa, to the French colonies of Martinique in 1910-11, onto Hawaii, and then arriving on the East Coast in North America in 1912, and then moved on to the West Coast of the US, where he founded the Ghada Party in I think actually 1913, which was another radical Indian group that drew in a lot of the Indian laborers on the West Coast, in particular, who were working in the timber industry, but also agriculture. So it was an intellectual movement that had close ties with the IWW, so some of the Wobblies, but also the anarchists, and then drawing on these Indian laborers who were in California and Oregon, Washington State at the time. He also became a really committed anarchist, was one of the directors of the Bakunin Institute in California at the time. And then in March 1914, he was arrested for his anarchist beliefs, but actually soon made bail with the help of Madame Karma here in Paris, and some Irish nationalists here in Paris, supposedly Maud Gonne, who was an Irish nationalist closely associated with Madame Calmer. And he quickly fled and turned up in Switzerland, where he then found lodging at the Pension Hoheneck in Zurich, which was the same boarding house where Cempe Karaman Pillai was also living. And Pillai was the editor of a publication called Pro-India. He was also the president of the International Pro-India Committee, which is sort of Swiss-based Indian anti-colonial group that drew in Swiss intellectuals, some German exiles as well. So Hardayal had made that journey from, I guess, London to Paris, then sort of North Africa to Martinique to Hawaii to the US East Coast to the US West Coast, was arrested and then escaped, turned up in Zurich in Switzerland again. That says a lot about sort of the movement of Indians as well. There are Indian anti-colonial groups in these spaces. And Hardayal is one of those figures who connects them. When the First World War broke out, the Indian revolutionaries in Switzerland had to remain neutral, and the groups that were in Britain and France were effectively shut down. And many relocated to Britain, where the new Indian Independence Committee, led by Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, known as Chatto, was working with the German government to overthrow British rule in India. Throughout the next 4 years, Hardayal was in and out of that movement. He was slightly ambivalent about the collaboration with the Germans. He kind of moved between Germany, Switzerland, and Turkey before he proceeded to Stockholm in Sweden in October 1918. And here actually joined the Indian National Committee. Again, obviously there was an Indian anti-colonial committee in Stockholm, which was set up by Chatto and M.P.T. Acharya in 1917 to negotiate Indian freedom with the European socialists gathered in the City for Socialist Peace Congress that actually never materialized. The end of the war also spelled the end of Hardayal's involvement with the Indian revolution movement in exile. I'll come back to that a bit later. I think his travels and shifting political ideologies are emblematic of this movement. Others, such as Chatto, Acharya, I've mentioned Pillai, would also move across Britain, France, Germany, Turkey, and Sweden, even into the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark. So to capture these movements and cross-border mobilities, I think we need to look beyond a nation-centered approach and embrace a transnational, or in some ways a trans-regional approach, focus on Europe in my case. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do in this book here. I'll come back to this photo actually later as well. Some of you would recognize this as a mugshot from when he was arrested in Switzerland. I'll come back to that later. To go back to the Egyptian Congress in Switzerland, Hardayal said, "We have no sympathy with the cant of constitutionalism." In doing so, he also outlined a different anti-colonial strategy from the one led by the Egyptians at the time, as well as the Indian National Congress, which was the biggest or the only party in India at the time, which operated within the boundaries of constitutionalism, and there were several British people on the Indian National Congress. And they often agitated for dominion status within the British Empire rather than complete independence, as the revolutionaries fought for. There were sometimes overlaps, but mainly the Indian revolutionaries in Europe predominantly refrained from the Indian National Congress people, even the so-called extremists within that movement, such as Bipin Chandra Pal, who fell out with the militants in Europe when he actually arrived in Paris in 1908, because of his unwillingness to support acts of terrorism. In fact, the Indian revolutionaries in Europe were not afraid of resorting to acts of terrorism, so broadly speaking. For instance, in late 1907, the Indians in Paris had been in touch with some Russian socialist revolutionaries, the Maximalist faction, to learn the art of bomb making. And they eventually got hold of a bomb manual that was then copied and smuggled back to India in late 1907, and then circulated amongst revolutionary groups in Bengal in India, and led to several bomb attacks against British officials in India. Another example, in July 1909, so shortly before Hardayal went to Geneva, the Indian revolutionary Madanlal Dhingra, who's seen here, assassinated William Curzon Wiley, a British official in London. A few years later, in June 1913, another example, 3 Egyptians and 2 Indians in Paris conspired to assassinate Lord Kitchener, the new general governor of Egypt. The plot was foiled, and then the Egyptians were arrested. The Indians were not. I'm not sure why. I don't know who the 2 Indians were. In the summer of 1915, Chatto and just to go back to this photo, Chatto and Abdul Hafiz, who were then based in Berlin, they'd set up the Indian Independence Committee. They traveled to Zurich in Switzerland and collaborated with some Italian anarchists to smuggle bombs, weapons, and poison into Switzerland, and conspired to assassinate a number of European heads of state and other prominent figures. The plot never materialized, but it kind of shows the lengths to which the Indians were ready to go in their fight against empire. So, just briefly, this photo here, Chatto had become one of the biggest enemies of the British in Europe, and they were trying to capture him. Obviously, you couldn't go to Switzerland to do this. You couldn't go to Germany to do this. So they tried to lure him to Switzerland, and then because of his romantic involvement with a French woman, tried to lure him across the border into France, where they could then capture him. They first had to get him to Switzerland. When he arrived in Zurich, he was promptly arrested by the Swiss police, who'd gotten wind of this somehow, and we actually don't know how. They captured him. That's why this photo here is from the police archives in Zurich. They also arrested the British agent who'd gone to arrest him, and who was captured with a dagger and a revolver and some poison on him. And so they said to Chatto, "Look, you were lucky we arrested you. Now go back to Germany." And they expelled the British agent who'd come. This episode was, just sorry, to go off script a bit. This episode was actually, so in Switzerland at the time, this is summer 1915, the British author W. Somerset Maugham, who was the highest paid author in the world at the time, was looking for excitement and adventure. And he knew some people in the British intelligence services and asked, "Can I be sent to Switzerland to work as an agent?" And they were, "You're probably too famous, but okay, we'll let you go." And he wrote some short stories about these adventures in Switzerland time that were probably too close to what actually happened. So Winston Churchill said to him, "Look, you cannot publish these stories." And they were published in the late 1920s. And he wrote a story about the British trying to capture Chatto. That was published in 1928, and turned into a BBC drama in 1991, actually. But I found some of the files in the German Foreign Office political archives about them discovering Somerset Maugham. And they kept, "Who is this? Is this really him?" This is really strange. But they have photos of him and everything, yeah. And he goes by the name of, I think Somerset is also in the undercover name that he uses. And he's thinking, yeah, this is too good to be true, but it kind of works. Anyway, it's a very sort of strange story that is then also part of this this movement. Anyway, I should go back to what I was supposed to talk about. Anyway, it was just to say that yeah, so the Indian revolutionaries in Europe were really willing to resort to acts of terrorism, assassinations, bomb plots, whatnot. And it kind of delineate a different strategy than sort of the Indian National Congress, which they were operating within the sort of the bounds of parliamentarism. So to go back to Geneva again, that Hadayal attended the Egyptian Congress in Geneva was not coincidental. In fact, the Indian revolutionaries in Europe often formed anti-colonial networks with the Egyptians, Irish and Persians, as well as Russians, Polish, Finnish, and other subject nations. And even though he criticized the Egyptians for not going far enough, the Egyptians were by far the closest allies of the Indians in Europe. So, for instance, in the wake of an Egyptian Congress held in Brussels in September 1910, and incidentally, I think the Congress was originally supposed to be held here in this building, but moved to Brussels at the request of the British. But in the wake of that Congress, an anti-colonial committee comprising Indians, Egyptians, Irish, and Persians was established. I don't really know what happened with this committee. It kind of petered out, perhaps, but there's a couple of reports about this committee being established. In Switzerland, there was, according to Ajit Singh, who had arrived in Paris in 1910, moved back to Switzerland in 1911. There was, according to him, and I quote here, a society of the oppressed of the world, as well as a society of Oriental people, which brought together Moroccans, Tunisians, Algerians, Egyptians, Turks, Persians, and Indians in Geneva. During the First World War, the German Foreign Office actively supported anti-colonial groups from India, Egypt, Persia, as well as the North African French colonies to instigate revolutions in the territories of their enemies, so Britain, France, and Russia, prompting actually Hadayal to call Berlin at the time the Mecca of the Orientals. Maybe someone can actually enlighten me on the history of this building here. I think I asked you about it before, but I think this building here was used for other purposes before. Maybe someone can tell me. Going back to Geneva again, Hadayal's new periodical Bandamatam was one of the most prominent Indian publications in exile and was immediately banned from import into India. The Indians often managed to circumvent the ban and smuggle the publication in, sometimes in consignment with revolvers or whatnot. The prominent Indian revolutionary Shyamji Krishnavarma's publication, The Indian Sociologist, was another example. It followed Krishnavarma from where he lived in London. He moved to Paris in June 1907, and then moved on to Geneva in June 1914. So again, if you want to study someone like Shyamji Krishnavarma, you have to go from London to Paris to Geneva. There was another publication called the Talva, which was a very short-lived publication edited by Chatto. It was supposedly published from Berlin, but actually from London, and then financed by Madame Karma in Paris. They were trying to throw off the British by saying, look, we've established a new group in Berlin. It wasn't in Berlin. And then from Switzerland, there was a publication called Pro-India, edited by Pillai, as I mentioned. It ran for only two issues before the outbreak of the First World War forced them to cease publication to not violate the politics of neutrality. From Geneva, there was also an Egyptian publication called La Patrie Égyptienne. Apologies for butchering the French here. Edited by Mansour Rifat, who was a very close associate of the Indians in Paris and later in Switzerland and Berlin. But it was actually also a really important venue for Indian anti-colonialism, but also shut down when the First World War broke out. And I think these publications provide insight into the intellectual articulation of anti-colonialism as a broad resistance to empire, but also into the events and activities of the Indians in exile, and into what kind of alliances and networks they formed, and into how they envisioned free India. So they give information about what's going on, but also articulating kind of anticolonialism as a strategy, as an ideology. And then I think they're sort of key venues for bringing together Indians, Egyptians, Irish, Persians into these kind of venues for publications, basically. So as I said, it was here they articulated the resistance to empire. They exposed also British oppression in India. They appealed to sympathetic European readers and connected the struggle against the British to wider struggles against European imperialism. As I said, when the First World War broke out, the Indians in Switzerland seized their publications to comply with orders of neutrality. And the leaders in Paris, that was Madame Karma and S.R. Rana, who I briefly mentioned before, were placed under house arrest and they were deported, respectively. Rana was deported to Martinique, actually, and he and his family were sent there. Others were said, look, you remain under house arrest or you will also be deported. So let me just say a few things about the First World War. I sort of talked a little bit about it so far, but I want to go into the First World War again a little bit. Because as I mentioned, the British were concerned with a sort of an Indian-German alliance that actually then materialized when the war broke out. So when the Indians allied themselves with the Germans, they found a powerful friend that opened new territories for them. So in September 1914, so a couple of months into the war, Chatto, who I mentioned before, went to the German Foreign Office and said, look, I have information about Indian revolutionaries. They are experienced in revolutionary activity. I will help you instigate a revolution in India. And the Germans were looking to instigate revolutions in India, Egypt, in all the colonial territories of their enemies, because it meant that Britain, France, Russia would then have to divert all of their forces back to the colonies. So it was sort of an alliance of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. To recruit members into this Indian revolution movement, and they went into prisoner of war camps to persuade Indian prisoners to join their cause. They published 2 newspapers, El Jihad and Hindustan. There were sort of prisoner of war camp newspapers. They even established a mosque in a prisoner of war camp outside of Berlin, basically to show particularly Muslim and Indian prisoners of war how benevolent the Germans were. See how well they treat us. Why don't you come and join our cause? They had limited success, but they managed to recruit some prisoners of war to join a mission that was going to go to Afghanistan through sort of the Ottoman Empire and then through Persia, which was British and Russian controlled at the time. But it actually managed to arrive in Kabul in Afghanistan in October 1915, and they negotiated with the emir to allow a revolution in India through Afghan territory. They never got full permission to do this. So the Germans went home. The Germans had traveled with them. The Germans went home, but the Indians stayed in Kabul and eventually set up a provisional government of India in Kabul. So this is the photo here, some of the leaders of the mission that arrived. At the center is Mahendra Pratap, who had arrived via Switzerland into Germany and then led one of the missions with Muhammad Bakatullah, who was a slightly older Indian revolutionary who traveled via Japan, the west coast of the US, and then arrived in Berlin in January 1915. They led the Indian mission, and these are some of the German leaders who went with them. So Pratap and Bakatullah stayed in Kabul and set up this provisional government of India that was supposed to then become the Indian government once they had ousted the British from India, basically. It never materialized. So while all of this was going on, in the kind of the center of gravity of the Indian revolution movement in Europe shifted again in May 1917. The tides of the war was turning a little bit by then. So in Stockholm from 1917 to 1918, the Indian National Committee, which was set up by Chatto and Acharya, published extensively in Swedish and Scandinavian newspapers that were trying to rally up support from neutral powers that were not beholden to Britain or France. They agitated here amongst the socialists who were gathered in the City for Socialist Peace Congress, which was then actually constantly postponed and never materialized. And Hardayal arrived, and he said he could write in a socialist jargon to make their propaganda more effective. But the European socialists who were in Stockholm at the time dismissed the Indian demand for freedom, as they argued that it was not directly relevant to the socialists and the question of peace. I think it revealed a lot about the limits, actually, of socialist internationalism and internationalism that did not extend to the colonial world. So the socialists were mostly social democrats. There were some Bolsheviks who also made it there. But by and large, the question of independence for India, but also Egypt and Persia, was largely dismissed. Again, the Indian revolution movement had then shifted away from, London, Paris, Zurich, Geneva, Berlin, a little bit in Istanbul, and then to Stockholm in 1917. Hardayal, as I mentioned, arrived in Stockholm in October 1918, but actually quickly fell out with Chatto and Acharya, who I mentioned had set up this movement. And Hardayal left the movement when the war ended just about a month later. He moved on to Gothenburg. Chatto remained in Stockholm. Acharya returned to Berlin. What happened to the others? Let me end my talk with a few sort of reflections on what happened later. So obviously, the Russian Revolution set in motion new prospects for the struggle for self-determination, now supported by the Bolsheviks. In mid-May 1919, so the German Revolution is still in full swing, the Indian revolutionaries in Berlin held a meeting to commemorate the 1857 uprising, which was sort of a central focal point for the Indian revolutionaries still. At that meeting, it was also decided to send a mission comprising M.P.T. Acharya, Mahendra Pratap, who made it back to Berlin at the time, and Abdur Rab, who was sort of a minor figure who was also part of the Indian Independence Committee in Berlin. It was decided to send a mission comprising these three figures to Moscow to meet Lenin and then reconnect with Muhammad Barkatullah of the Provisional Government of India in Kabul, who had now made connections with Lenin in Moscow. They eventually met Lenin in July 1919 and set off for Afghanistan shortly after. And here Acharya and Rab broke with Pratap, who they consider sort of a bourgeois nationalist, and set up the Indian Revolutionary Association, which was a specifically socialist Indian socialist organization, but not affiliated with the Communist International yet. So, as a delegate of the Indian Revolutionary Association, Acharya attended the Second Congress of the Communist International in July 1920. And after that Congress, Acharya became one of the founders of the Indian Communist Party in Tashkent in October 1920. So I guess I'm trying to say that the communist movement in India comes out of that exiled Indian revolution movement in Europe. The photo here is from the Second Congress of the Communist International. Sitting here is actually the four Indians who attended the Congress, and they were, in some ways represented four different strands of Indian revolutionaries in exile. So first sitting here is Abani Mukherjee, who was invited by a Dutch communist, and he's invited as an Indian communist, even though there were no Indian communist parties at the time. Sitting next to him is MPT Acharya here, who was, as I mentioned before, he was invited as a delegate of the Indian Revolutionary Association. Sitting here is M.N. Roy and his partner Evelyn Roy. They attended as delegates of the Mexican Communist Party. They'd been in exile in Mexico. Sitting here is Mohammad Shafiq as a representative of the provisional government of India. So basically 4 different strands of Indian revolutionaries in Russia at the time. Very quickly, M.N. Roy seizes control of that group of Indians, and they have to fall in line and join the Indian Communist Party and cannot be members of any other groups. Which means that, well, MPT Acharya, who I've written extensively about and is more of an anarchist at the time, is expelled from the Indian Communist Party only 2 months later and joins the ranks of the anarchists. So it's just to say there's a longer history of Indian communism that comes out of this movement. Another legacy, back in Berlin, many of the Indians who collaborated with the Germans during the war were now kind of stuck in Berlin. They received a kind of pension from the German government for their activities during the war. The revolution obviously had failed. They were seen as traitors to Britain, and as such, they could not return to India. Out of this exile came 2 organizations. In 1919, the League of Oppressed Peoples, with Chembakaraman Pillai on board, and in 1927, the League Against Imperialism, led by Virendra Chattopadhyay, Chatto, which was a much bigger organization that is often seen as a precursor to the Bandung Conference in 1955. So the photo here is the League of Oppressed Peoples, and this is Chembakaraman Pillai. One of the few photos I've actually found of him. There's some Irish, Chinese, and Turkish members of this the League of Oppressed Peoples. I don't know how long it existed for, but not more than a few years. The League Against Imperialism up here, this is from the founding Congress in Brussels in February 1927. Seen here is Virendra Chattopadhyay, Chatto. This is Jawaharlal Nehru, later the first Prime Minister of India. Just out of the photo here is Muhammad Barkatullah, who I also mentioned earlier, who also attended that Congress. That existed until, I think, 1933 or 34, the rise of the Nazis banned the League Against Imperialism. Again, but it's a very sort of strong legacy that comes directly out of the Indian revolution movement in Europe and comprises many of the people who've been in that movement before. Another legacy in India then. Back in India, the Indian revolution movement in Europe was also felt quite immediately. In response to all these activities that the Indians in exile, the British enacted the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act in 1919, which then sparked massive protests that led directly then to the repression of those protests, including the Amritsar massacre in April 1919, which then in turn kickstarted Gandhi's nonviolent campaign again. Just briefly about Gandhi, because he's obviously a major figure. He was in South Africa for most of the time in the early 20th century, but he visited India House in London in 1906, and he was again in London in, I think, August 1909, shortly after Madhavan Dhingra had assassinated a British official. And his agitation is very much in response to the kind of militant agitation by many of these other Indian revolutionaries. So there's another afterlife in India through Gandhi. And then let me finish with Vinayak Savarkar. In 1924, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, one of the leaders of India House in London, and who had briefly fled to Paris in late 1909, and then gone back to London in March 1910 and was immediately arrested. He was released from prison in 1924. Savarkar had already espoused anti-Muslim sentiments during his time in London, but that had certainly grown during his time in prison, and now, upon his release, conceived Muslims as India's real enemy, not Britain. He also denounced Gandhi struggles. He charted a new violent anti-Muslim ideology that actually has reverberated across generations and inspires Narendra Modi's regime in India today. Just briefly, this photo here is from India House in London in April 1909, and it's Savarkar sitting here at the center. MPT Acharya is sitting here. This is VVS Iyer, who was also briefly in Paris, and this is Govind Amin, who was also in Paris and was known as a really militant figure who was very willing to procure weapons and would file off the serial marks and numbers and then send them back to India. He was also a degenerate gambler, and he was working for some of the, sorry, this is going off script now. He was working for some of the Indian pearl merchants who were financing all these revolutionary activities. He'd then stolen some pearls worth, I can't remember how much money, but a lot of money, and gambled away all of that, and he's lost so much money. And then the Indian pearl merchants actually report him to the police, and now he's trapped, and he ends up committing suicide and trying to get out. It was in the French newspapers at the time, actually. But also a really interesting figure, although a very sort of tragic ending, obviously. So just to go back to Savarkar and one of these figures whose actions and ideology still reverberates across India today. So in some ways, the Indian Revolution movement in Europe from 1905 to 1918 is still felt amongst politicians today.